Today's guest speaker is Robert Philbrook. Robert Philbrook has 3 decades of experience in genealogy and historic research recording the lost histories of soldiers from the Revolutionary War through Vietnam. Mr. Philbrook is also a combat veteran of the Iraq War, having served a total of 10 years in the United States Army Infantry on 4 continents, both in the 1980s and after September 11th. With a passion of military history, it was in 2021 that he learned the existence of a treasure trove of letters, photographs, and documents of his wife's grandfather, who was a doctor in the European theater during World War II. They had laid mostly forgotten in the basement of the family's home in Ohio since the end of the war. For the past couple of years, Mr. Philbrook has not only brought the story of the 111th Evacuation Hospital back to life, but located over 50 family groups of descendants of the men and women who served in the unit. For most, it was their first knowledge of that their veteran relative had experienced during the war. Today's presentation is the first public telling of the unit's history and the poignant echoes of the words written by the frontline doctors from the greatest generation during World War II. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Robert Philbrook.
All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor and a privilege to be here at Palm Springs Air Museum. I thank you for attending today, and I will promise you will get 1 hour of very interesting information out of this, so please stick around for everything. So this story began, for me at least, several years ago. My wife's grandfather, Captain Ditch, who's up there, and I realize I got this little button here. Whoops, there we go, knew that he served in World War II and was a doctor. What I didn't know was that while that conversation was going on in the family home in Ohio back in the 90s, downstairs in the basement was a treasure trove of photographs, letters, and ultimately a diary which contained the entire day-by-day history of the 111th Evacuation and what Captain Ditch had experienced during the war as he wrote home to his family. That lay forgotten down there up until about 2001. I had found one of the family members who actually had the original diary, and my father-in-law, who was supposed to be here today but tragically passed away a little over a week and a half ago, was able to get a copy of that diary, and I began to transcribe it. As I transcribed it and was posting about what I was discovering in the diary on Facebook, my wife's cousin called and said, "Hey, Pops," who was their nickname for their grandfather, "there's a bunch of his stuff down in the basement. Do you want me to go see what that is?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Wow, there's a lot of stuff there." And I'm like, "Well, like what's a lot?" And she sent me this photograph behind me, and it was stacks and stacks of these letters. There was hundreds and hundreds of pages, over 100 photographs, including original photographs from Dachau concentration camp in July of 1945 that you will get a chance to see here towards the end of the presentation. I was very excited and immediately said, how can I see these? She said, "Well, we'll box it up and send it through the post office." And I'm like, no, you're not. You're going to keep it right there. I'm going to book a flight, and I'm going to come out, and I'm going to spend a week there scanning all these letters and photographs. And this is what I found when I got there, and this is just like one of the pictures of the many things there. So to start out with a history that's almost lost, Captain Ditch and his wife Louise, who was affectionately called Narnie by the grandchildren and who I know her by, Captain Ditch was the town doctor of Caldwell, Ohio. And Caldwell, Ohio is a little tiny town of, I don't know how many, 2,000 people. And everybody in Caldwell, Ohio knew Dr. Ditch. And in February of 1942, just a couple of months after Pearl Harbor, he goes down and enlists at the age of 41 to go serve in World War II. Now, he didn't need to go. He was the town doctor and could have easily been exempted from service at both his age and his profession. But he wanted to be where the boys were. Sorry. They had 4 children. They have Mary Louise, who is the older girl here. Eddie, who was the older son, my father-in-law Sam, and the youngest, which is Lynn, who was the baby of the family. And this is on the family home, on Louise's family's home in Kentucky here in this photograph. And so each day of the war, he sent home a letter to his wife. And what he couldn't write about in his letters, he wrote in a private diary. And so today, you're going to hear the words from World War II of what Captain Ditch saw, what he was thinking, and experiencing throughout his time in the Great World War II. Uncle Sam calls him to war. There's a telegram stating that he would join the 824th Tank Destroyer Battalion as a battalion surgeon. He ends up going to a variety of camps, serving with the 824th Tank Destroyer Battalion. And these are a couple of pictures. He was at Camp Hood, Hunter T. Robinson, and a number of other camps as he prepared for war as the battalion surgeon. But like many things that go on, you get transferred around a lot in the military. And for those of you who served in the military, you know that you don't always stick with the same unit all the way through. He moves over to the 627th Medical Clearing Company in early of 1944. And he's attached there for a little over a month before finally being reassigned to Camp Swift in Texas and assigned to the 111th Evacuation Hospital, semi-mobile. The 111th Evacuation Hospital had been training at Camp Swift since the latter part of 1943 as the hospitals began to prepare for the great invasion of Europe. Everyone knew it was coming. Of course, nobody knew where it was going to be. And the 111th was in the queue along with everything else getting ready to go. The soldiers, nurses, and officers came from all over the United States. Many of the enlisted men came from the New York, Bronx, New Jersey area, but it was a very diversified group. There was a Chinese American within the unit. There was a Middle Eastern American in the unit. There were people from originally Jews from Russia that had immigrated, and they were either first generation or second generation Americans for many of them. So these are some pictures here from Camp Swift in late 1944, and that is Captain Ditch apparently teaching map reading, which is kind of an odd thing for a doctor to do, but that's what he did there according to the backside of that photograph. So this photograph here was absolutely instrumental in my research. This is the unit photo taken in June 1944, showing the officers, nurses, and enlisted men of the 111th Evacuation Hospital. It was from this photograph that I began to track down a large number of these people. I'm happy to say that I have been able to identify every single nurse within this photograph, every single officer within this photograph, and maybe about 20% of the enlisted faces in there. We do have a roster of names, but it's been a challenge through research to try to find who everybody is. But as I was able to reach out through the wonderful part of the internet, through Ancestry.com and the rest of that, and make contact, and including one of the families that's here today, the Pincala family, they were able to say, oh, you know, that's my grandfather in that photo there. And that was a very rewarding thing. So in the 111th Evacuation Hospital, there were 40 nurses, 40 officers, and right about 200 enlisted people. And these are among the faces up there. Let's see, Pincala is, I believe this one, is that right? Yep, there we go, that's good. I believe this is Walter Coppinger. This is Di Petro, one of the enlisted. This is Captain Richmond, one of the other doctors, Lieutenant Beabout, Lieutenant Prosser, and this is Thomas Payne, and who has passed away, but his wife, Mary Catherine Whitby Payne, is still alive. She's the oldest descendant and is 102 this year. So there is one surviving member of it, and his family was very instrumental in providing some of the additional details I'm going to be telling you about today. From Camp Swift, they moved to Camp Kilmer in New Jersey in June of 1944. Now, the invasion at D-Day Normandy beaches had already happened, and of course, with the mass number of casualties, they needed to quickly move more evacuation hospitals into the European theater. So the 111th Evacuation takes a train from Camp Swift, Texas to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. They basically do final staging. They get their ID cards there, final shots, last wills and testaments, and the rest of that, and prepare for the crossing of the Atlantic over to England, where they will stage before crossing the English Channel to land in the Normandy beaches and support American operations in Europe there in the summer of 1944. The 111th Evacuation Hospital boards the RMS Mauritania as part of their Atlantic convoy. And among the convoy going over with them is the mighty Queen Mary that you can see down in Long Beach, California. If you've ever been down to Long Beach, make sure you see the Queen Mary. Captain Ditch says it was a sickening sight to see the Statue of Liberty fade into the distance. We all wondered when we would see her again. He writes about the journey across the Atlantic, the threat of the U-boats that were out there hunting them, the occasional seagull that they would see, and then finally seeing Ireland and the coast of Scotland and England as they come into Liverpool with the arrival in England. The 111th Evacuation leaves the RMS Mauritania. They take a train over to Cheddar, England, and that's where they would begin to stage while they wait for their turn to cross the English Channel and land at the Normandy beaches as the American Allies pushed into France in its liberation. Captain Ditch writes, "The streets are narrow and crooked, the houses just typical of the movie towns of King Arthur's time. Frankly, in my mind's wandering, I would not have been surprised to see a knight in armor on his steed turn a corner and speak to me." He's absolutely smitten with Cheddar, New England, as he writes home to his wife on August 10th of 1944. From Cheddar, England, after a couple of weeks there, and including one officer who meets an English gal and marries her, which Captain Zarecki does, and Captain Ditch says is absolutely nuts for doing that. But they head down to the English coast and board a landing craft infantry, LCI 95, and cross the English Channel to Normandy Beach. This photograph here came from one of the relatives, actually Lieutenant Beabout, who I was able to locate her granddaughter, and among her photographs was this photograph here of them on LCI 95. She didn't really know what it was about, and I was able to tell who the chief nurse is, Captain Wright. One of the other nurses here, I'm sorry, I'm really a little nervous, so their name's escaping me at the moment. And we believe we've identified this soldier here on that. The officer, unfortunately, is not identified because we don't have that good of a photograph, but you can see additional landing craft, and there are some barrage balloons, and we believe that this is actually a photograph right off of Omaha Beach, because the barrage balloons would not have been along the English coast, because at that point the Luftwaffe didn't really have any control across the English Channel at that point in the war. Captain Ditch writes, on September 2nd of 1944, I got up at 6:30 a.m. and went up on the forward gun deck, and sometimes the front of the boat was 15 feet higher than the back. Waves would wash across the deck, and we would duck them most of the time, and they would go over us. The storm was so strong they had to put back into port in England, and they were delayed crossing for one more day. Up here you see the actual gun deck. This is a photograph by Lieutenant Beabout's collection showing one of the 20mm anti-aircraft guns there, and a U.S. Coast Guard photograph of LCI 95. After we got off the main boat, we were brought to the beach in one of those square-like landing boats, so they went in on one of those Higgins boats. What we saw were similar to those pictures in Life magazine. It sure must have been a battle, and what he's describing is Omaha Beach. If you go up to the library here in the Air Museum, you can actually look at the Life magazine copy that shows the photographs of Omaha Beach. And when I was doing my research, it was fun to be able to say, oh, what Life magazine was that, and see the actual photographs that Captain Ditch was referring to here in September 5th of 1944. From the beaches, they move past the temporary American cemetery along the beach there, seeing the white crosses, and they know the cost that was paid the liberation of Omaha, Utah Beach's gold sword of Juneau. They move into the town of Carentan, and if you watch the television HBO series Band of Brothers, there's a whole episode on the Battle of Carentan where Easy Company takes that. Well, the 111th Evacuation Hospital was there after Easy Company's take of the town, but that is the same town. And in that episode from HBO's series, you see a tank battle, and this is one of the destroyed tanks that was from that battle. And on top of that, there is Lieutenant Beabout there in the back, and Lieutenant Bellick standing there on top of one of those destroyed German tanks there in Carentan. Captain Ditch writes to his wife, "There are foxholes all along the fences, and it all showed signs of a terrific battle. Saw a lot of houses and buildings just shambles. Snipers must play an important part in the war. It seemed that all the attic windows were shot out, as well as smokestacks. It just made me wonder while riding down the road, how our soldiers must have fought to get this place." Within Carentan, the soldiers go to a nearby Catholic church. I was able to locate where this church is in Carentan, and I'm looking forward to hopefully in a couple of years going and visiting that. Also, they were just east of Tucker Bridge. For those of you who are World War II fanatics and know a little bit about the Battle of Carentan, Tucker Bridge was a famous bridge built, and Tucker was the engineer that was killed there. And this is a photograph that Captain Ditch took of that bridge there in September of 1944. While in Carentan, we have the amazing story of Brownie. Now, Captain Ditch, who was a doctor of 41 years, was kind of a gruff old man at times, but he writes this charming story about this dog named Brownie. And as I was reading his letters and transcribing them, he says, "Brownie seemed to like the unit mess better than we do. So when we pulled out," meaning when they left Carentan to go further into Europe, "he accidentally got fastened into a truck when the farmer nearby wasn't looking and just naturally came along. His English was as good as our French, but since then he understands English fairly well, but we still can't understand a word he says. So he must be the smartest of all. Unlike GIs, he likes KP. Matter of fact, he spends most of his leisure cleaning garbage cans, and on his time off, he can be found in the kitchen." Later on, he writes, "Most of the doctors are relieved that he likes KP more because we're afraid he was going to take our job." So we have this wonderful story of Brownie, and as I began to find these different descendants of the 111th through Ancestry and through my messaging and Facebook, a person sends, "Oh, my father has some photographs, I'll send them to you." And among the photographs that I received was this picture of the dog, and it exactly matches the description of Brownie. So we now actually have a photograph of Brownie along with Captain Ditch's memory in his letter home to his wife in October of 1944. They were set up in a cow pasture just east of Carentan, about a half a mile away. He said, "There are a lot of cows around here. The Germans were chased out of here so fast they could not destroy them," meaning kill the cows. "There is one that has a thing like an apron over its face and eyes. I heard it touched off a mine and it blew its eyes out, and they put that over its face to keep the flies away." Captain Ditch is located over here in this photograph, and they're censoring mail. And it's been interesting as I find the photographs to see the initials on the back that say censored, and I can tell which officer was in charge of censoring those photographs. Sometimes it was Captain Ditch, sometimes it was some of the other. This is Captain Cook over here, and I'm sorry the other captain has slipped my mind at the moment here. As they traveled around and began to bring in, transferred some of the wounded that were coming in from the front and moved them to the evacuation hospital ships that were sitting off the English Channel there. Among the places they went through is St. Lo. And he writes about St. Lo in September. "We left here shortly after noon and went south about halfway to another coast and then back another way, and did we see a lot of effects of the war. The town we are near is sure bad enough, but some of the other towns are nothing but rubble. Gosh, I hope we never have a real war at home." Between his diary and the letters, I've been able to piece together what these photographs were of at the time, whether he listed them down or he talked about in his letters and the diary about the same time what he was referring to. From Normandy, they worked their way through France at the end of September and on into Belgium, where they stopped at the town of Eupen in Belgium. They staged there. This hospital train was used to transport the majority of the officers and nurses along with some of the enlisted, while the other enlisted moved the hospital ambulances and equipment of the 111th Evacuation Hospital. Their final destination was with the 9th Army, which was going to be located in Holland. This photograph here again comes from one of the descendants there. We see nurses, officers, and enlisted men in the cow pasture fields there in Eupen. In Captain Ditch's diary, he says, in Eupen, Belgium, that's where he was at the time, and we were able to see huge flashes from our guns shooting at the German town of Aachen, which was about ready to be captured, one of the first German locations to be captured in that sector of the European theater. The 111th moves its way into Maastricht, Holland, which was 9th Army headquarters. And at that time, they began to basically do a part where they start working with other evacuation hospitals and understanding about how they're going to run their hospital. And they start to see their first casualties. Captain Ditch writes a letter home in October 9th. He says, just got back from an evac hospital. Some of the casualties were German and their injuries the same as our men. They were frightened and certainly expected their throats to be cut or their arms to be cut off or something more horrible. We had a hard time convincing them that they were going to get good care. Wish I knew more German, I'd talk to them. And again, let me go back, sorry. And this is Captain Ditch here. Oops. This is Captain Ditch next to one of the ambulances there. So this is the hospital building that is in Herlin, Holland, that they were based at, and Captain Ditch was in the receiving section in these tents here. This building still exists, and I was able to find photographs of it on Google Maps. And so here we see, I'll kind of, toggle back and forth here. You can see it hasn't changed much since October of 1944. And this section right here would have been where those tents were at. They settled into Herlin as part of the 9th Army Evacuation Hospitals. Among the people supporting them there were some Dutch Red Cross nurses and this priest here, because they didn't have a Catholic priest, and Captain Ditch was Catholic. He was happy to have a local Catholic priest to be able to do mass and things for the Catholics that were casualties or members of the unit. Captain Ditch is located over here along with other members of the 111th Evacuation. Their names are up there: Corporal Sassman, PFC Bailey, Lieutenant Withy, Sergeant Hadler. Lieutenant Beabout's over here. Again, her granddaughter was kind enough to provide a number of these photographs, along with Lieutenant Couch. This is Tech 3 Liza, Lieutenant Ford, and Captain McCool, who was a very close friend of Captain Ditch's. So what was the purpose of an evacuation hospital? What was this, like a MASH unit? Well, MASH units weren't quite created there, but the evacuation hospitals were probably the closest thing to a MASH unit that was there. What you had at the front lines here was your frontline medics. These would be company medics, battalion medics, things like that, and they would get them back to a battalion aid station. From there, they would go to a collecting station and then moved by ambulance to a clearing station and an advanced field hospital. And if they needed more serious treatment, they would be moved several miles behind the lines to the evacuation hospital, and this is where the 111th Evacuation Hospital would have been. At the time of the taking of Aachen, the hospital in Herlin was about 5 miles behind the front lines. So that's a shorter distance than like from here to Indio. So that's how close they were to the frontline battles. Behind that, evacuation was by additional ambulance, evacuation trains, or the Skytrains, which is outside. We'll see a picture of that here in a minute. And then hospital ships that would take them across the channel to a general hospital, at that point located mostly in England, As the war progressed and it became safer, they moved some of the general hospitals across the English Channel and based them in France. Here we have a photograph of the receiving tents. This is where casualties would arrive from the front, and Captain Ditch would essentially triage them and send them to the different areas, whether that be surgery, shock, minor wounds, things like that. Captain Ditch writes in his diary of November 12th, hospital opened yesterday. We had 45 patients. First 24 hours, some extremely bad. One with a large hole in his buttocks where an 88 millimeter, that's a German gun, hit him. Johnny, meaning Captain Clive Johnson, operated. Intestines were out. Have worked like mad these past 2 days, but it is worth it to see the boys taken care of. As soldiers arrived from the front lines, and here we see one arriving to the 111th Evacuation Receiving Hospital, they would have one of these tags on them that would have been filled out by the clearing station or the battalion medics that would tell a little bit about what their injuries were and what happened and where they were injured at. Clerks within the receiving tent would transfer that information on to additional information. And we see Captain Ditch here with his team, some casualties, and this clerk here would be taking that information and logging it into their morning reports. Those morning reports still exist and remain in the National Archives in Missouri. I was able to acquire through the generous donations of the people within my Facebook group and some additional donations in order to purchase these. And we now have lists of the casualties, where they were injured at sometimes, and how they were injured on it. Captain Ditch writes in a letter home to his wife on October 19th of 1944, while at the hospital, a young fellow came in wounded. Not serious, but he had quite a story to tell me about how he was wounded. He was a real honest fellow from the southern states, and it was something to hear. All about being in a basement with a couple of other fellows, how they would rush down the steps and the Germans would pick them off or be picked off, and how the wall was covered in all that stuff. It was hair-raising. In the shock ward, he states, seeing all the casualties like I do in receiving certainly makes me want to see this war over. But it's a wonderful how some of these men's lives are saved. I had 6 today that would be dead if it were not for plasma and blood. One in particular was carried in, looked pretty pale, dilated pupils, ashen gray. I looked him over hurriedly to make sure of his condition and immediately sent him into the shock ward. He was about dead. I told them that he needed instant care, and he got it. Captain Sparks started the blood, etc., and I went in about an hour later, and he was wide awake and talking. Captain Ditch was so proud of the men that he was able to save, along with the other nurses and doctors that were there. He writes about it all through. When I was in Ohio going through the photographs, they were a jumble. And as I started to look through the photographs, I came across what looked like an operation. There was a picture here of this nurse applying anesthesia to one of the casualties. And as I began to go through all the photographs and organize them based on whether they looked like they were in France or Germany or Holland, I realized that there was a series of photographs of an amputation going on. This nurse was identified by her granddaughter. This is Lieutenant Beabout applying anesthesia. And when I showed the photographs, this was the first time her granddaughter had seen her grandmother do anesthesia from the war. Later on, Captain Richmond's family, who had a couple of the photographs and recognized them, said, oh, he wrote about this amputation. And so we have a little bit of a story. Captain Richmond wrote, this was a second lieutenant who had a wound to the thigh, not an inch long, but it tore his femoral vessel with a tremendous amount of bleeding. And during the operation, it was difficult to control. 7 days later, we had to amputate the leg. This shows the initial incision when I tried to save the knee joint. But the vessels were in such condition that it would have been unwise to do it, so I had to disarticulate off the knee, which is the second incision. This is tying off the large vessel after the leg had been mended. And so between the combination of photographs from Captain Richmond's family that were generally shared with me and the several photographs from Captain Ditch, we see that operation here and the price that was paid by this unknown second lieutenant for the freedoms that the Europeans have and we have today. Here we see a shrapnel wound. Captain Ditch writes in his diary of December 1st, "A captain lost both his eyes tonight. Perpetual darkness. Nothing could be worse. Result of an air raid here in town today, when 25 were injured. Have not been able to sleep due to it." Being as close as they were to the battle lines, they were not able to save every person. This is a soldier here, Sergeant Bussner. Captain Ditch writes, "I've watched men die in the hospital just panting away for a few hours beyond help. I used to think of their folks back home, probably wondering how he was. Gee, war is terrible. One hates to think about it." And so this sergeant here from an infantry unit died at the hospital. His body was moved to the Margraten Cemetery just down the road from Herlin. And there he lies today. The Margraten Cemetery has such respect from the Dutch people that every single gravesite is tended by a Dutch family to this day. There is a 3-year waiting list for someone to take over. They do not give up those graves very easily, and we were able to contact one of the Dutch families that takes care of the only casualty of the 111th. So from the 111th, they were evacuated often by these C-47 Skytrains. And they have one here at the Air Museum, and I encourage every one of you to go see one of those. This photograph shows them from these Dodge ambulances loading the casualties onto the cargo versions of these C-47 Skytrains. This particular photograph comes from Walter Koppinger's collection, who was one of the Tech 5s in the 111th, and it was taken apparently near Gifhorn, Germany. This is a very rare photograph taken by an unknown soldier of the 111th Evacuation Hospital, and these are black medics, African-American medics, loading wounded onto the C-47 Skytrains. And of course, right behind is our very own Palm Springs Air Museum Skytrain. So again, I do encourage you to go see that if you've not already done so. Being so close to where they were positioned in Herlin, they were right along the Siegfried line. Here we have some enlisted men of the 111th Evacuation, of which I've identified a couple of them, and the famous Dragon's Teeth. Captain Ditch is up here with his photograph with them at the end of the war. It says, "I went through the Siegfried line and saw the Dragon's Teeth and pillboxes and all of that, and believe you me, they were hard to take. It looked exactly like the pictures in Life magazine." That was written in October 30th of 1944 to his wife. As we go into December of 1944, we find the Battle of the Bulge. And the 111th Evacuation was about 11 miles north, right about where that red dot is there, west of Aachen, slightly east of Maastricht. On December 17th of 1944, Captain Ditch writes in his diary, "Having quite a number of air raids, a few anti-aircraft units are being bombed. Supposed to have been German paratroopers dropped all around us last night. Got 2 wounded and 1 died tonight. I guess a whole battalion were dropped. Planes have been over all night. We are all apprehensive and naturally scared. Their bombs, as well as the ack-ack, is quite disturbing." What these men were part of, these German paratroopers that landed right outside, in fact, Captain Ditch writes later on, the reasons for the paratroopers is more evident now than it was before. The Germans put on a push of theirs almost 11 miles from here, and here he's talking about the Battle of the Bulge. And there were German paratroopers that literally landed way off course in what is known as Operation Stozer. It was the last large-scale German airborne operation of World War II, and as they were scattered all over the Battle of the Bulge landmass there, a number of them were inadvertently dropped over Herlin. These photographs here are from National Archives and the German Bundesarchives. With Christmas and the snows, the winter came, and here we see the nurse, Lieutenant Margaret Fleming, standing next to the 111th Evacuation sign right outside the hospital. Captain Ditch writes home on Christmas of 1944, but those poor fellows up ahead, not so far from here, are in cellars, foxholes and mud, with eyes just trying to get a glimpse of them so that they can kill them, meaning the Germans. Some probably died violently today. I know some have been wounded, but we can be thankful that I can sit down and write to you all tonight. I hope that I can still see you all again and even be with you before another Christmas. At this point, he had been gone since July of 1942. He's been gone 2.5 years, and now he's away on Christmas. On January 1st, a large German air raid, one of the last large-scale German air offensives of the war, Operation Bodenplatte, happens. Captain Ditch writes in his diary on that morning of January 1st, had a dozen air raids and they're still going on. A plane just went over our tent. God, it is an awful feeling. They bombed the square here about 1 or 2 blocks from here, and the place was full of dust here. Don't know if the bomb raised it or I did getting out of here. It is an awful thing night after night. We have a sort of semi-basement here, but it is difficult to get there before the raid is over. Well, I do hope this war will be over this year. I hope. This is a picture of a German Messerschmitt that was shot down near Herlin, and it was located during my research. During the bitter cold of the winter of 1945, we see the 111th Evacuation there. Captain Ditch writes in January 8th of 1945, it snowed a lot last night. It isn't good weather to fight. We're not getting many casualties. Haven't had a German prisoner since we shot down an airplane and the parachute troops came down here. We are all packed up, ready to move. We're on the north flank of the Bulge. The Germans tried to break through at Sittard, but we're stopped. It would be bad if we had been cut off. We have been drinking quite a lot lately, more as an escape mechanism than anything else. Now, as a former soldier, alcohol in a war zone was very verboten, but Captain Ditch freely talks about the amount of alcohol that they are all drinking during the war. And a funny story that was told by his oldest daughter to me, Mary Louise, was because the alcohol was rationed, they were only allowed to have so much. So the people back home would pack the alcohol into Listerine bottles and send them over in their care packages. And Captain Ditch often writes in his letters, "Oh, thank you so much for the Listerine you sent." And he's talking about the extra alcohol that was in the bottle. They continue on in Holland through March of 1945. 9th U.S. Army forces have pushed into Germany, and now the 111th Evacuation is getting farther and farther away from the front. Casualties begin to taper off, but again, they're still dealing with the men coming in that are wounded. He writes in his diary of March 2nd, 1945, 9th Army has Gladbeck, and the 2nd Armored is across from Dusseldorf. We are the rearmost evac. Hope we move up soon. We're 40 miles behind the lines. When we came, it was 2.5 miles. We should be across the Rhine soon. It was absolutely fascinating to read through these letters and seeing almost a moment-by-moment description of the war. As a fan of World War II, I had some basics, but to get literally a day-by-day account of things that he could write about to his family or in his diary, and all the things I can't share with you because it's literal, like all of it's written down and it's almost like 900 pages. It's a fascinating story, and you're getting just a glimpse of it here. Here is an example of one of those admission and disposition reports where it lists the soldiers and how they were wounded. This particular one is German wounded, listed as patients with the 111th Evacuation possible. Based upon the date and some of the other soldiers that were wounded, I believe that it was possibly captured elements, or were Germans captured by elements of the 102nd Infantry Division, the Ozarks, during fighting between Viersen and Krefeld. And if you're German and I pronounce that wrong, I apologize. In his letter to Louise, he writes, "Got more POWs. I keep away from them now. They're usually lousy," meaning with lice. "They are a sorry lot, all right. It makes me mad, the people in France, Belgium, and Holland without much food, or they tell me, our own casualties, that the Germans have everything. They are scared to death as well." As the 9th Army advances, you can see this map here from a newspaper article. And Herlin is located, where you at? Right there you are. And 9th Army has begun to push through, and you see them getting closer and closer to the Rhine. Over here we have a knocked out pillbox coming from, I believe, Walter Coppinger's collection, and it has different road signs. As cities were destroyed, of course, there wasn't, there's not Google Maps back in that day, so you had to have road signs, there had to be signs everywhere, and so we see a number of these signs that say where things are at. Occasionally, I've been fortunate enough that it gave some distances, and I've been able to back count the number of distance in order to determine where they were actually photographed at. Captain Ditch stands here in Jülich, Germany in 1945. He writes in his March diary, started out this morning at 9:30 a.m. in an ambulance to Germany, went from Berlin to Linnick, Erkelenz, München, Gladbeck, Dulken, these other names. The towns, farms here all the way were in perfect ruins, giving the Germans a taste of war. Everything is just blown to hell. All sorts of signs were up with the swastika and Hitler this and that. Did not go up to the Rhine because of a promise I made to Louise, his wife. The civilians are glum. I rather imagine our next step will be across the Rhine. In late March of 1945, the 111th Evacuation leaves their friends in Herlin and crosses into Germany, stopping at Dulken. And here we have a photograph showing a chow line and the tents that were set up. This was a 24-hour bivouac area, and this location is still in existence. I was able to also find it through Google Maps search of Dulken, and based on some photographs of the place, was able to match up some things in the photographs from the family that sent me these. Oops. Sorry. He says, left Herlin yesterday and stayed at Dulken, now we cross the Rhine. A couple of days after 9th Army elements cross the Rhine, the former Colonel King, leaves the 111th Evacuation Hospital, and Colonel O'Brien takes over as commander of the 111th. And so this is the famous crossing of the Rhine River, and Captain Ditch calls it across the Rhine with the mad Colonel O'Brien. I thought this was a little bit of hyperbole on the fact of Captain Ditch, that he just wasn't a fan of Colonel O'Brien. But it turns out that Colonel O'Brien, unfortunately, led the 111th Evacuation almost into German lines because he couldn't read a map very well. In his letter to his wife after the end of the war, he writes, we crossed the Rhine a couple of miles north of Dinslaken. The Germans were stirring up the water with 88s, but never got the bridge. We were right with the infantry, and artillery was shooting over our heads. These photographs Captain Ditch had in his collection and show LVTs of the 747th Tank Battalion. Normally these were seen in the Pacific, but over here they used them to cross the Rhine River. And he takes this photograph, or one of the men in his unit takes this photograph that was in his collection. Over here we see one of the crossing boats, a jeep, one of the Duck W's, one of those amphibious things. And over here, though you can't see it very well, is the body of a German soldier. Whoops. Louise writes in one of her letters, and Captain Ditch replies, you asked me what happened to Mad Colonel O'Brien. I never told you what happened. Captain Ditch's letter to his wife recalls the Rhine crossing, and unfortunately Colonel O'Brien had a mental breakdown after almost running the unit into lines instead of turning south towards Dinslaken. This was confirmed through both the daily reports that shows him as a patient there for basically PTSD, that's not what they called it during the war, and the account of Lieutenant Beabout, who said that the colonel got naked and ran through until they committed him to a psychiatric facility. And this is Colonel O'Brien. At Dinslaken was a labor camp. And Captain Ditch writes, life in Europe must be the least expensive thing in the whole world. I just witnessed one of the most horrible things I ever saw in my life. Up the street 1 block, there's a refugee camp, Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, Dutch, French, Italians, and every other type of person. They've been liberated by the army. They were people forced to work by the Germans, at least 5,000 in one building, men and women all sleeping together. As the war progresses, Germans surrender in the thousands. And here, as they move from Dinslaken to Bad Salzwedel, we have a photograph from World War II archives of Germans surrendering. Saw thousands of Germans POWs on their way back, he writes in his diary of April 18th of 1945. They arrive in Wolfsburg, Germany, and this is where the Volkswagens were made. And he writes in his diary, we're at a hot, going the wrong way. He writes that they're in a town where they made automobiles, and he's talking about these German Kubelwagens that were made there at the Volkswagen factory. These are some of the photographs of slave labor buildings, and then the now hotel that they stayed in. They were almost cut off by a German offensive there, and he talks about in his diary that it would have been horrible to have been captured so late in the war. Among the tragedies that he finds, he writes in his letter to Louise in April 23rd of 1945, not so far from here, the Germans have been made to bury about 1,800 Poles and Russians they had burned alive in a barn recently. Captain Williams and Zarecki were up there today, and it's an authentic atrocity. And this was the Gardelegen massacre, where the Nazis had herded in all of these Jews, Poles, and Russians, and they couldn't evacuate them from the camps, and nobody was to be left alive, so they burned them alive in the camps. Army Signal Corps took photographs. Some of you may have seen them, and one of the family members sent me this photograph, and they just thought it was dead soldiers, and I said, no, this is from a very famous atrocity that happened. These are the crosses that were there. This is from Captain Richmond's collection, and over here in the Army Signal Corps, you can see the German civilians that were press-ganged and forced to go exhume the bodies and rebury them in the Gardelegen cemetery there, outside of the massacre site. From there, they moved to what was affectionately called the wheat field. This is where they would be at the end of the war in May of 1945. Another family member sent me these photographs. These are Germans surrendering at the end of the war and German wounded coming into the hospital at the wheat field. The nurses, of course, were off limits. They did not officially approve any fraternization. However, after the war, it was interesting that a couple of people got married afterwards. And there were a couple of photographs of Lieutenant Whitby and Lieutenant Payne together, and Captain McCool and Lieutenant Shearer later married after the war also. I do believe this is Lieutenant Prosser, yes, over here on the left. As the war ended, it became time to relax. One of the most interesting photographs, and this one comes from a black and white negative that I found within the collection. This American soldier here, probably one of the security details for the 111th, holds a German STG-44 assault rifle. Captain Ditch on the left, Captain Zarecki playing the violin on the right. Captain Ditch posing next to a German Messerschmitt Bf-109 as the Germans surrender in May of 1945. As the war ends, they get a chance to go to the Elba River, and over here we see Captain Ditch, I'm sorry, I forgot his name here under pressure of time, along with some Russian soldiers here along the Elba River. Here, Russian POWs captured during the war by the Germans are moved by American trucks back to Russian lines. A wrecked German Junkers 52 German transport over by the wheat field. And Captain Ditch and Captain Wenger, sorry, that was the other gentleman in the photo with the Russians. They're standing in a town there in Germany, and you can see a sign that says Berlin. It's like 236 kilometers away. The nurses also got together, a lot of bonding friendships here. This is Captain Wright there, who was chief nurse, Lieutenant Beabout, Betty Shearer, and some of the other nurses there. Captain Ditch's other officers here for some of the doctors and things. Captain Johnson is over here in the wheat field. In July of 1945, as everyone began to rotate home, Captain Ditch and other officers and nurses of the 111th were reassigned to another evacuation hospital unit. And it was at that time that Captain Ditch was able to tour the death camp at concentration camp at Dachau. And these are original photographs shown for the very first time of the photographs that he took while at Dachau. He writes in his diary, On the next day, we went through the Dachau concentration camp, saw the barracks where they put 1,600 men that were designed for 200. The gas chambers were where they asphyxiated prisoners, the place where prisoners were shot. The crematory, bone, ash was all over the place. Among the photographs that he has here is the armored tank turrets that were on the death trains that brought Jews from the east as the Russians pursued and the Jews were moved from the eastern concentration camps such as Auschwitz and the rest. They were brought into Dachau before it was finally overrun by American forces. In July of 1945, U.S. medical personnel and German medical personnel stand around one area of the Dachau concentration camp here that Captain Ditch took a photograph of. Like many soldiers from the war, he brought back some mementos. One of them is this little German Luftwaffe dagger, which you can see up here on the little memento box. The rest of the family has the other things, much to my son's, Captain Ditch's great-grandson's chagrin. He really wants this Walther P-38, but that's owned by one of the other family members. And this little shadow box was there of the Germans quitting. So as everyone began to go home, most of them were transported home in transport ship, such as the USS Hermitage. Most of the nurses went home on transport ship. Captain Ditch was lucky enough to fly home in one of these Douglas C-54 transports. One of the 111th evacuation is they are farmed out to different units and come home. Most of them are home by late 1945, with a couple of them remaining as an occupation in Germany until January of 1946. So when you got home, you got what was called a ruptured duck. Captain Ditch arrives home on October 4th of 1945, and they watched a movie, and he writes home, "The movie I watched here reminded me of July 27th of 1918. Dad," and he's speaking about his father here, "signed up for World War I, but made the mistake of stopping me otherwise." Captain Ditch was 17 years old at the time. "It was a terrible mistake. But he," meaning his father, "didn't know. He didn't realize you can't live in a country for 150 years and not fight its wars. It has been tough being in this one. It has probably cost a lot of money and gray hair, but to Mary Louise, Eddie, Sammy, and Lynn, there is no greater gift I could have given them and their children. When I think of the chaos, deceit, religious intolerance, depression, segregation, honor, pride, etc., I, you, the children, their children's children, will be honored citizens. Now that the war is over, I'm safe, I feel well, and I think the price has not been too great." These words from Captain Ditch in August of 1945 remain buried in the family basement. It has been an honor and a privilege to bring this story to you. With the end of World War II, the greatest generation fades into history. Luckily, one remaining member, which is Lieutenant Mary Payne, Whitby Payne, was the last surviving member. She was 101 in 2023. Her son, Michael, is in contact with me, and she sends her well wishes to everyone here who has attended today's event. Sorry. Captain Ditch passes away in 1983. Margaret Fleming, who was a nurse there, she was able to celebrate the 50th anniversary of D-Day with Queen Elizabeth in England. But now, Lieutenant Payne, Whitby Payne, is the last surviving member of the 111th evacuation. I would like to personally thank all the people above here. I'm not going to read it all in the interest of time because I think I've met my maximum time in like 60 seconds. So I think I'm right on time. But I want to thank all of the family members that I've been able to contact for their generosity of providing these photographs and additional anecdotal things that just add to the story that Captain Ditch wrote about in his letters and diary. Today is Sam's 89th birthday, Captain Ditch's son. Tragically, 2 weeks ago, he suffered a stroke and passed away early last week. He was not able to be here today, but I hope that he's watching from above. His daughter, my wife, Jill, is in the front here. And we also have We also have members of the Pincala family here, Tech 5 Pincala from the 111th Evacuation. And if I could have the Pincala family please stand up. Members of the Pincala family, thank you. We can please give them a round of applause. So I want to thank all the descendants and relatives, soldiers, nurses, and officers of the 111th Evacuation Hospital for the ability for me to share this story. I especially want to thank the Palm Springs Air Museum for allowing me the opportunity to share this. And I think at this time, if Kevin allows, we have time for some quick questions and answers. And I'm here as long as they'll allow me. Thank you very much.